2,000 years ago, the Indians of the Amazon rainforest were using a form of agriculture called slash and char. Now, they only had stone axes for chopping down rainforest. So chopping down trees was quite a drama, so they didn't clear any more than they needed to, and they reused the sites rather than the current practice of slash and burn, where they've got chainsaws and they can knock down chainsaws and bulldozers and they can cut down massive areas. Now what they used to do was they used to get all the organic material, whether it's chopped down trees or weeds or manure or everything, I think, and they used to just put it into big piles and put dirt over the top and then set fire to it in a smouldering sort of a fashion that just produced charcoal, which they then mixed back into the soil. And the result was that 2,000 years later, we still have the most fertile soils in the Amazon are called terra preta, T-E-R-R-A, P-R-E-T-A, and they're man-made soils produced in these cultivation areas of the Indians 2,000 years ago. And the Amazon rainforest has massive rainfall, and it tends to wash out the nutrients out of the soils. However, charcoal has this nature where it holds on to the nutrients and water and provides a home for bacteria and fungi, because internally it's a lot like a sponge, and it has this property called adsorption, spelt with a D, where it actually attracts stuff, and that's how activated charcoal works. It actually attracts stuff to it. So what you can do to create our own version of terra preta is to make charcoal. You can call it biochar if you like, but it's the same thing. And you can infuse it with nutrients before you put it in the soil, otherwise it'll tend to pull nutrients out of the soil. So I put it in a compost heap. I put it in with my compost, and it sits in there for about a year, because I have a slow composting process. Or you could put it in a liquid, such as compost tea or sea salt or something like that, something to charge it up with nutrients, and then you can mix it in with your soil. Now, one other very useful thing about charcoal is that because it doesn't break down in the soil, it's locking up carbon. So like here, I'm producing anything up to half a ton of charcoal a year if I'm get into it, and that would equate to a couple of tons of carbon dioxide that would have otherwise ended up in the air just by the process of wood breaking down and going back into the soil, because the carbon dioxide is released in the normal breakdown process. So if you're concerned about man-made global warming and want to reduce your carbon footprint, then producing charcoal or biochar is a good way to go about it. So when I was making charcoal initially, I was using this thing, which I got from a design on the internet, where you have to cut up all your pieces about the same size, load them in very specifically, and you light it at the top, and it burns down and produces maybe about this much charcoal. Now the problem with that is, that I found, was that firstly it's hard to know when it's finished. Sometimes I opened it up and there was still significant amounts of uncharred wood in there. And the other problem I had was that it's very difficult to put out charcoal in something like this. I tried at first using water. You need a lot of water, but the trouble is that there's still a lot of heat in there, and it boils off all the water, and you come back 15 or 20 minutes later and it started up again. So I'd have to come back 3 or 4 times adding water to it. So then I tried putting sand over the air inlet and covering up these holes here, but it didn't cut off the air sufficiently. There was still enough air seeping through for it to just keep smouldering away very slowly. So it was a bit of a problem. And also I realised that there was a lot of waste. I'd be sitting out here watching all this heat going up here and feeling the heat radiating off it and going, what a waste, I should be using that heat. So I've developed a method for using just a normal household wood heater for making charcoal. And let's go and have a look at that. When you're loading up a wood heater to make charcoal, it's best to try and load it up so that everything finishes at about the same time. So here I've used some really big bits. They'll burn for a couple of hours and they should finish at about the same time. When you're making charcoal, you're often starting the fire more regularly rather than just leaving it burn for 24 hours or something. So to get it started quickly, a blowtorch is pretty useful. You can see I've closed the door on the blowtorch and that stops the smoke coming out. So those 3 lumps have burnt down pretty well. This is a couple of hours later. Been heating the house beautifully. Now we can break them up a bit. If you break the charcoal off the outside of the lumps, it will expose the unburnt wood inside and allow it to char properly. The yellow flame is wood gas burning. That's what's given off in the process of the wood charring. And when all of the wood gas is gone, you're left with charcoal. So the aim is to get it to the point where there's no more yellow flame. We just want a bed of coals, just with a bit of bluish flame perhaps coming off that bed of coals. We're now almost there. Nice bed of coals, but there's just one little bit still not quite finished. Sometimes you might open it up in the middle because there's one bit that might not be burning as well as other bits, and you might shift that into a place where it'll burn more quickly. The aim is to get everything finished at about the same time.
we're ready. Breaking up some of the bigger bits of charcoal and just mixing it up a bit just to find if there's any bits that haven't quite burnt properly yet, but it's looking pretty good. When you're shoveling it out, it can get pretty hot. So use a good glove. This is an oven mitt and you'll need a long sleeve shirt. The coals are just charcoal glowing red hot. So there we have the beautiful charcoal. We need to be careful with charcoal that we put it out completely because it can self-ignite if you still leave it a bit hot. So we'll have to leave it to cool down for a few hours before we try and put it into anything that may be flammable, like a plastic bucket or something. This is just going into a very large saucepan with a glass lid. Glass lid is no problem. The only time you can have a problem is if you use a saucepan with plastic handles. Then the plastic handles can be developed. The best way to extinguish it is just to cut off the oxygen. Don't try using water because you use too much water, it's ridiculous. So we just put the lid on. And watch how quick, once it's starved of oxygen, how quick it goes out. You can see the colour start to fade straight away. Now it just needs to be left for a few hours for it to cool down properly, so it's thoroughly cold before we pour it out into anything.
What I've got here is I've filled this bag about a third or a quarter full of charcoal. The charcoal straight out of the heater. Although this particular one has been washed, I'm doing an experiment with washing some of it. Now what we got to do to crush it, we're going to crush it by driving the car over it. And this fabric is quite a strong fabric in these fertilizer type bags. And we'll just tie them up. Flattening out what's in there. Now what you've got to try and do is when you tighten them up, just fill them up, is trying to get as much of the air out of them as you can. Because I've found that if there's too much air in them, when you drive over it, the wheel can fluff it up on the other side and it can get caught on the car's underside. You've got to try and get as much air out of it as you can. And you probably only want the charcoal about that thick, that way it'll crush better. Now, now what I do is I turn the bags over and do it again, and that gives us the most thorough amount of crushing. It's surprising how well these bags last. Even though they're just a simple plastic woven style bag, they do last pretty well, and very rare have I ever had them get holes in them. Eventually they die, but I get multiple uses out of them. So let's have a look and see how it went. We'll open up one of these. This particular bag, most of the bags here, these are done dry, straight out of the furnace, and as a consequence very dusty, but that's what we're getting. It's not as fine as it would be nice to be, but there is fine stuff in there. Now let's try this one. This is an experiment. This one, the charcoal was washed first and allowed to soak in water for about a day or so, and it absorbed a lot of water. Charcoal can absorb quite a lot of water because it's a bit like a sponge inside. This is quite a bit heavier. It's not dusty. Now look at that. It's possible it's broken it up a bit smaller. Oh no, there's a bigger bit. Yeah. So the reason I tried washing this one is firstly to see about dust suppression, also to see whether the water might act as a lubricant and help it to break up, but also because depending on how much charcoal you're putting in to whatever you're using it with, the ash, there's a bit of ash with this stuff. You can see there's a bit of grey ash in it, whereas that's been washed out of this one. So the ash itself is quite alkaline, which is good if you're only using it in a small quantity because it acts like lime. So if you're just using a small amount of charcoal, spreading it over mixing it in with quite a lot of stuff, this will be fine. But if you want to use a lot of it for any reason, you're probably better off doing this because otherwise it might be too alkaline. But it certainly suppresses the dust, that's for sure.